Good morning, everybody. This is episode 24. For those who haven't tuned in before, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk, the director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing, or MICA.
And today we have a guest, Gareth Higgins. Do you want to say like a 2-sentence summary of your totality?
Actually, you had a really good one before we went on.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm a human from Ireland living in the U.S. and I write and I write books and edit a magazine that we put together and lead festivals and retreats that are all about trying to help each other get more conscious about the stories we're telling and asking ourselves if they're true or helpful, and if they're not, can we learn a more true and a more helpful version of the story, because that'll be better for us and for the world.
Can how you've done a lot of different things in your life, and how did you start thinking about like, I need to focus on the story aspect of the stories we tell? Has that been always the emphasis of your work, or was there something that happened that kind of shifted your emphasis?
I think there was the under the surface version of it before I started clearly thinking this is about story. And the under the surface version was I grew up just outside Belfast. I was 19 when the ceasefires happened in the north of Ireland and Northern Ireland that led to our peace process. So like my entire childhood was still, living through this thing that we called the Troubles. And it did affect our family directly and indirectly in very intense and profoundly challenging ways. So there's that, you grow up and then you come to know that other people don't live that way. Other places aren't like that. Now there's a lot of places that are like that and a lot of places that are suffering more, but I always kind of knew something was happening where we were that was different to other places. And I liken it a little bit to people who grow up in very abusive family situations often don't realize that there's something. They know it's they know they don't like it. They know it's very painful, but they don't realize it's not a universal experience. They don't, maybe until they come into encounter with other families, and that can be a very traumatic experience. In some senses, the person can end up feeling worse, more lonely, but eventually with the right kind of assistance and support, it can be a clarifying moment that helps a person own their own pain and say, not only was this wrong, it singled me out, and then there might even be solidarity with other people who had similar experiences. So like growing up in Northern Ireland, I think might be a little bit like that. And I hope I'm not stretching an analogy there. We knew there's something weird about us. There's something broken about us. And the other piece, I always say this when people ask me about my formation, there was the experience of growing up in Northern Ireland. And then there was December the 28th or 29th, 1988. When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was broadcast on the BBC for the first time. And my parents insisted that I stay up late to watch it. This is unusual. Parents usually don't insist that their children stay up past their bedtime.
Usually watch a movie.
That's right. Usually they want them to go to bed early. And this movie, I remember this distinctly. It started at 10:45 p.m., at least in my memory. That was way past my bedtime. But they insisted that I see it because they'd gone to see it when it came out in 1975, and for some reason there was a long period before it showed up on TV, and they made me because they wanted me to have this experience of this astonishing story, which later I understood is one of the key manifestations of what Roger Ebert meant when he said that the movies are a machine for empathy. Because these people in this story, I had no, they were nothing like me at all. I didn't, it was about as far removed from me as you could get. But of course, they're exactly like me, and I'm, and I'm like them, and I'm like all of them, including Nurse Ratched. including the villain. I am like the
Yeah.
villain too, and I am like the victims, and I am like the heroes.
Mm-hmm.
So it was later that I realized what was happening to me as a child was Northern Irish people were telling a story about ourselves that might not have been true, or that certainly might not have been helpful. The story for lots of us was, we're doomed and they are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so, first of all, we're doomed meant there's no hope and there's no possibility of doing anything about your circumstances. And I'm not saying that this is the only story that everyone believed all the time. It was one of the dominant stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part, they are wrong. It's their fault. Well, that's never true for the most part. It's rarely true. It's rarely true that it's just them. I would suggest there's no such thing as them. It's all us. I'm a huge, totally captivated by Alexander Solzhenitsyn saying the line between good and evil doesn't run between one person and another, but through the center of every person. But that doesn't mean that some people don't do more evil things than others. Like, I think we can get into a weird kind of poetic relativism that doesn't serve us. Hitler definitely did more evil things than I've done. Definitely. It's just stupid to argue otherwise. And it doesn't absolve me of responsibility for the painful impacts, maybe even the evil impacts I've had on other people. So that it was that realization, we're telling a story. The story might not be true. The way we're telling it might not be helpful. And we need to be exposing ourselves to life through the eyes of the other in order to understand ourselves or to create the possibilities of peace. And One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a red letter day for me.
Yeah, that's great. And we've got somebody from England here commenting about this recent book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Which is a great book about trauma and healing and the way that that traumatic events really embed within our embodiment, and so these stories kind of aren't just in our minds. Sometimes we think of stories as being just in our minds, but really these stories actually become embodied within us, and that's one of the reasons that they're challenging to rewrite.
Well, and one of the amazing things about Bessel van der Kolk's work and Peter Levine's work and the work of I forget her name right now, is it who wrote the book on sensory motor psychotherapy? I've got it on my shelf, but I can't see it right now. Is the difference between talking about something in a broken way for decades and getting nowhere, and having a handful of sessions that honor your body's memory can be revolutionary. I've had that experience myself, learning to slow down the way I speak. I'm doing it right now as we speak. I'm choosing to speak a little slower. I'm choosing to breathe a little slower. Had in many ways it enabled me to change the story. I had been trying to change the story without knowing anything about how the story had been embedded in my body. And then so someone helped me work with the body out, and that enabled the story to change much more quickly. And then again, whatever therapy is helping you, keep doing it. And if you haven't looked into the way our physiology traps memories, the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we breathe, take a look at that. Anyone who's listening who wants it, and it may be meaningful to you.
Right. So then, in terms of connecting all of this with the pandemic, we've been talking a lot about how the pandemic is this very revelatory experience, right? That it's unveiling all of these stories about our economic system, stories about our healthcare system, stories about how we relate to one another, stories about our own feelings about our health and our life and our well-being, and that it's providing this very powerful and in many ways painful opportunity to look at these different stories. And so yeah, what are some of the ways that specifically in relation to the pandemic maybe that you've been thinking about that recently?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and somebody mentions narrative therapy, which is another storytelling. Yeah.
I think it's a really beautiful question. And the initial thought that I have about it is just before the pandemic became an obvious challenge within the United States, which was later than it should have been noticed. A friend of mine posted on Facebook that he had written a letter. I think he'd printed it out and he'd hand delivered it to each of the neighbors on his street. And the letter said, "Dear neighbor, I'm sorry that it took a public health crisis to get me to introduce myself, but here we are. If you find, my name's Bill, this is my phone number. If you find yourself in need and God forbid you get sick and you can't leave the house, please don't hesitate to call me and I'll get you groceries or supplies if I can. I'll leave them on your doorstep and then we can reunite when the pandemic is over." And he said that he'd gone and like someone had refused to take the letter from him out of fear, but he left it on the doorstep. And later that day, she brought up homemade jam for him. And it was I believe it was the first conversation they'd ever had. And so I immediately thought, hey, Bill's someone I want to follow here. And so we did the same thing on our street. And 8 of the 12 households responded with, "Thank you so much. Of course, we make the same offer in return. Love and trust. Love and trust." And the other 4 just didn't, there was no negative response. They just didn't respond. And they may not have seen the email. And our 93-year-old neighbor who's lived on the street since 1961 before any other houses were built there, when I called her, because she doesn't use email, and obviously I couldn't go up to see her because of social distancing, when I called her to offer the assistance, she said to me, "If you and Brian, my husband, if you and Brian need anything, don't hesitate to ask." And she's 93, you know, and like that's, it's actually, I'm aware it's latent ageism in me that is even telling that story, you know, because we don't expect that of someone who's 93. Actually, she's the one we should expect it of. She's the one who's had the resilient life. She's the one who's seen it all. She's the one who doesn't panic. You know? So the first thing was Bill, who I'm sure he wouldn't be offended by me saying this. He's just a guy. He's just a person. You know, he doesn't have, he's not being driven around in a limo, and he doesn't have 50,000 Twitter followers. He just did what was right. And the pandemic gave him the cover to do it. Because we have these middle-class social mores that say we shouldn't offer to help our neighbors, even though we all know that's what we would want them to do for us. We all know we would want our neighbors to make that offer to us, but we're scared to offer it because maybe we've heard extremely rare stories about something awful happening when someone knocked on their neighbor's door, but those are not normative stories. Just the same as hoarding toilet roll is not a normative, typical example of what's been happening when people go to grocery stores. I know of people who've been going to grocery stores and they've been buying one extra of everything so they can give it to their neighbors. You know, we've made the worst aspects of human behavior the normative stories that we tell. So the pandemic is giving us, I think it's like an acceleration of being able to do the things we always knew we should, and we always knew we would want other people to do for us. Yes, there is fear, and yes, there is definitely death, and there is definitely suffering. To not hold back. I can think of a funeral of someone who was very special to me in Belfast 15 years ago, whose widow stood up at the end of the funeral and said, "When you think of me and you think I might give her a call or I might go and visit her. And then the voice in your head comes up and says, oh, no, she probably wouldn't want me to bother her. Bullshit. Let me make that choice. Don't withhold your love from me. If I don't want to see you, I'll tell you I don't want to see you. 9 times out of 10, of course I want a visit or a phone call. Of course I do. So that's like the neighborhood thing. I think the fact that most of us are now spending most of our time much closer to home induces more of a possibility of being neighbors. And then at the kind of macro level, a teacher of mine, Mayhan Seiler, who's also been around a long time, he said to me a few years ago in regard to the massive unexpected political changes that were happening in this country that some people were loving and a lot of us were feeling very frightened resulting from. He said the only thing
what might those be? I can't think of anything.
Well, that's the reason I don't name it. I think it's too simple to just say Trump or the election. Partly because I know people who had sincere, good faith reasons for voting for him, and I think they're wrong. I think it was a mistake. I think it was a false story that they believed. I think part of the problem was they were not offered an alternative story that they could trust. Now that's generous, but I still think it's okay to be generous, right? And I don't know what they would think now.
Yep.
But unless we can actually have conversations in which in which we don't stereotype each other, but also hold strong accountability around what the impact of these choices has been. So my friend said to me a while back, he said, the only thing that middle-class white people have lost in these last few years has been a false sense of certainty about the future. The only tangible material thing, if you can even call it material, tangible, palpable, has been a false sense of certainty about the future. Everybody else already lived with uncertainty. Everybody else already lived with a sense of being marginalized, excluded. Perhaps things felt like they were evolving. I still think they are evolving. I still think that there's more respect for human rights than there's ever been in world history. There's more respect for equality. There's more respect for people who are not white cisgender males. There's more inclusion. And there's a huge rupture in that. It's not a fully linear, high-speed journey in one direction. And so people like me, the part of me that is a white middle-class cisgender male, all I've lost has been a false sense of certainty about the future. Now, the part of me that's a bisexual person and a member of the LGBTQ community has had a complex experience in the last few years of feeling afraid and targeted, and also experiencing the solidarity of that community and the solidarity of straight allies in ways that I hadn't experienced before. And the part of me that's an immigrant is aware that I'm one of the most privileged kinds of immigrants that exist in this country. And yet I still don't have the sense of shelter, security, of roots in this place. That on the one hand enables me to see things that people from here don't always see, and I can do things, and I've been very deeply welcomed by the people. On the other hand, I often feel insecure, confused, uncertain. Am I even home here? So the macro level piece for people like me, for the part of any of us that is white, cisgender, middle-class male, is to ask ourselves, what am I going to do with the power that I actually do have, that I do hold? How am I going to use that to serve the common good? And yes, even me, a white, cisgender, middle-class male, has needs. Even I have needs, both material, mostly spiritual and emotional. I need solidarity. I need connection with community. I need a sense of meaning in my life. And I need to be dislodged from the fear that retaining my quote unquote status as a white cisgender middle-class male is all that important in the first place. But it's got to be replaced, like just dislodging me from all that privilege. It's got to be replaced with something.
Mhm.
Don't just
Yeah.
pull it. Don't just
Right.
open a trap door under me and say we're going to drop you down the hole because you represent a group of people who have sometimes misused their power.
Yeah.
I want to serve, and I have needs as well.
I often talk to people about, so I grew up in rural Minnesota, grew up very conservative. And so I feel, even though it's harder for my brain to wrap it around it, I still connect with the logic, the sort of this narrative that's been pumped into particularly rural areas via radio of an easy narrative of whiteness, even though we wouldn't talk about it that being under siege, scapegoating immigrants, all those sorts of things. It's a powerful story that helps make sense of anxiety so that I know who the bad guy is, right? And on the flip side, my experience largely within leftist and progressive spaces is it's not narrative driven so much. Instead, I've often felt like it's performative. So you have to perform a certain way out of some sort of altruism for people that are not white, which to me is kind of a mistake, because I think everyone wants to feel like they're part of a meaningful story that they can find life-giving. And asking people who've been bought into a scapegoating narrative to give up privilege out of a need to be a good guy isn't a story with enough teeth. So I'm wondering about like these, the reason that this sort of, Trump appeals to so many people is he helps advance that narrative for so many folks. What's the alternative? I mean, this is if it's about story, like what stories could we be telling?
Yeah,
that would be beautiful for someone who would have voted for Trump in the past.
Yeah.
Besides just scapegoating that person.
Well, and I guess before we jump into that, given that that we are this is a short event here. We've got some great folks listening. I'm wondering if those of you who are listening, if there's anyone that wants to throw up a thing or two that you're noticing about either a story that is being disrupted, a new story that you're trying to write in your life, or a story that you're finding is really challenging to press against during this time. So if you've got that would be great to put up there. Oftentimes we get the best comments at the 31-minute mark when we're ready to sign off. So please go ahead. I know we could probably listen to you talk in your the accent that all Americans love the best for another couple of hours.
Here's some comments that have come up, just to throw them up here. This is a great quote. The winners write history, the losers sing songs. Our bodies deserve both. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, I really like that.
And Maria writes, it took a pandemic for most people to look at their neighbor, in my opinion. I think that's true. Like, I suddenly found myself more concerned and neighborly because of this. And before, I would have just been okay just not knowing my neighbors as much.
Yeah, no, I think that whole phenomenon of being in our houses more, for years, I've really thought that, one of the sort of functional stories that's very odd about our society is we have these nice houses that we basically just use to sleep in. And, not only what are waste of resources, space, all these kinds of things. And right now you see people, I mean, we were taking a bike ride yesterday and Deborah, my wife, said that. She's like, boy, talking over your fence to your neighbor is actually coming back, because you now see people actually doing that. And that's pretty interesting. I think a lot of people are finding, many people are really challenged by being at home, but there are a lot of stories coming out about, people saying, wow, actually being at home with my family more is kind of nice. And I don't know that I want to go back to not doing that.
To speak to the question about what's an alternative to the story that people have been, the two sides, the performative thing or the scapegoating thing. Well, like, first of all, scapegoating doesn't help anybody. And in my view, the only appropriate scapegoating is when I'm willing to allow myself to be scapegoated if it is the only way to protect a vulnerable person. Me scapegoating somebody else doesn't help.
Right.
But the alternative story I would want to tell is this thing that, Brian McLaren and I worked on some stuff together, and he really initiated this idea for me that the stories humans tell attempts at answering a legitimate question. So, like, we have this domination story that says the way I'll get peace and security is I will rule over you. Now, that's an answer to a legitimate need for leadership. The answer to that problem is not no leadership. The answer is servant leadership that prefers the common good. And then there's a revolutionary revenge story that I'll get peace and security by overthrowing you, and then I'll rule over you. And that's an attempt at answering the legitimate question for justice and an end to oppression. The answer to that is not just exchanging one form of oppressive leadership for a slightly less oppressive form. It's restorative justice that even makes room for the former oppressors if they're willing to lay their weapons down outside the room before they come in. And the story that says, you are the problem and I'm going to expel you, is an attempt at answering the legitimate need for moral boundaries, right? Like, genocide is bad and wrong, and we should do what we can to stop it and prevent it from happening in the first place, but not through purification narratives that are their own form of character assassination or genocide. What needs to be begun with is that Solzhenitsyn thing about looking inward, seeing where I am responsible for causing suffering in the world, beginning there, and then finding less violent ways of restraining oppressive people. And there's more versions of these stories. What I would want to say to people who feel beleaguered is, I'm your partner in your own happiness, and you're mine. And so bring what you have and ask for what you need, because I can certainly benefit from some of what you have, and I think I may have some of what you need too. And maybe the first step toward that, and the way we talk publicly these days, is we have got to stop stereotyping and dehumanizing each other and ascribing motivation to somebody's insides when all we can see is what they're doing externally. Like, and that's not Pollyanna, and that's not giving people a pass. It's actually rooted in the history of how we bring an end to violence, how we reduce violent conflict, and how we create the possibility of collaboration. You still need to have truth and reconciliation commissions. You still need to have an accounting. You still need to have amends being made. But you're not assassinating, even at the level of character assassination, your opponents. You're preferring the needs of the vulnerable and the weak first, but you're recognizing that even some of your opponents feel themselves to be weak and vulnerable. And I think a lot of people who voted for Trump felt themselves to be weak and vulnerable. And some of the case, it was because they had been made vulnerable by previous policies. So there, but for the grace of God, go any of us. And the good news is every one of us has all of these competing energies inside. Like I said, you could see me as a privileged white cisgender male. Cool, I am. I'm also a bisexual immigrant. So I can bring what I have and ask for what I need. You can too. You can too.
Here's a wonderful quote from Kimberly. I wasn't looking for heaven or hell, just someone to listen to stories I tell. Anytime anybody quotes Toad Wet Sprocket, I think that's a good day.
I think so. Can I say one thing very briefly, just echoing that? First of all, I've looked it up and remembered that the author of the sensory motor psychotherapy book I spoke about earlier is Pat Ogden. But somebody defined trauma to me recently as trauma is what happens when a significant wound is not met with adequate empathy. Both at the time it happens and then over time.
No.
And that's what I hear Toe the Wet Sprocket is saying almost as poetically as I did.
That's Toe the Wet Sprocket you're diminishing.
They don't sing. They don't sing in an Irish accent. I'm at a genetic advantage.
That's right.
That's true. Connie writes that the pandemic has helped me find peace in staying at home and making room for what God wants me to do right now. It is a new season of my life to deepen my life in prayer.
Right.
I think there's been a lot of turning inward for good and for ill that's happened in this time. And a lot of people I feel like there's almost this nostalgia that comes in a crisis. And it's a crisis and you're slowing down. So, I've heard people say, oh, they're watching the movies they watched as children. They're watching, there's this sort of this nostalgia nostalgia is weaponized a lot in the United States of America to, make America great again. But it's also this, hey, along the way, we've set aside some things that were powerful that now we can go back and retrieve and choose a different way forward.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I do think it's very important. I've heard a lot of people say they even feel guilty thinking about this. I do think it's really important to notice the positive things that are happening now.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, I've heard people say, well, I feel guilty about saying that this good thing is happening, because there's so much suffering going on. And again, it's not that, well, we want this suffering to go on so that I can have something good happen to me, right? I mean, we're not endorsing that at all. It is, though, that this is an event that is occurring. This is something that is being forced on the entire world. Mm-hmm. And so it is worth noticing, all right, what is emerging that, again, we want to keep?
Mm-hmm.
What is emerging that is life-giving? And and to pay attention to that and to actually then start to bring some of those things forward. Because, there is this very powerful move to just say, let's go back to the way things were. Well, we all know that there were a lot of problems with the way things were. So, so this is really a great opening to find some of these new things. And let's see, does Mark vanished for a second?
I think there was some internet issues, but that was like God telling us our time was up.
Yeah,
maybe.
Our time is up. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This
You're welcome.
Been great. As you've probably seen, these fly by really quickly. Thanks for everybody for listening and watching. Great to have everyone with us. And we will see you tomorrow. Right? And we're working on another guest. We're working on some other guests, but we can't announce that yet. So
yeah, you have to live in suspense.
That's right. All right. Take care.
Thank you.